Okay, so thank you everyone. We're really delighted that you can join us for what is the first online teaching and learning in archaeology and heritage conference. We'll just start by saying a few words about who we are and why we're doing this conference. So I'm Karina Croucher. I'm a senior lecturer or associate professor in archaeology at the University of Bradford.
And I'm Hannah Cobb. I'm a professor of archaeology and pedagogy here at the University of Manchester.
And I think it's fair to say that Hannah and I have both been keenly interested in teaching and learning throughout our entire academic careers. Probably inspired at first when we were both working for the Higher Education Academy, back when we were doing our PhDs. We're working with Thomas Dowson then, who set us on the trajectory of incorporating research into teaching and learning into all that we do. And obviously we've been inspired by others along the journey too, notably Don Henson and some people who are here with us today, Meg Conkey, Ruth Tringham, Rosemary Joyce, Matthew Johnson, and others here have all inspired our journey to thinking about the value and importance of teaching and learning in archaeology and heritage.
So as Karina mentioned, the Higher Education Academy in the UK, there used to be the archaeology, history, classics and archaeology subject centres, and every year there was a teaching and learning in archaeology conference, and it was so important for us and as our teaching careers developed to be there to hear about how teaching and learning was happening and how people were developing things and innovating. And because of various political changes, the Higher Education Academy subject centres closed sort of 2009, 2010. And we're conscious that this kind of
You muted, Hannah.
Oh, have we been muted the whole time?
Just a few seconds.
Oh, okay, phew.
Are you
Something's flashing up that's on the screen.
Do we need to start all over again from the very start?
I think it's only a few seconds, I said. No, okay.
Oh, how did I mute myself? Anyway, so I was talking about the Higher Education Academy, and they had a brilliant conference. There was an annual conference, but it stopped around 2010, and we've both really missed that and hearing about what other people are doing. And if you're interested in reading the various background about that, we've talked about it in our book, which we're shamelessly plugging on the screen there. But in the last year, we were thinking about how brilliant it is that everyone started using Zoom, that we're able to all sort of talk and communicate more across the world. And we decided to sort of start a series of monthly round tables to talk about teaching and learning in archaeology and heritage in order to sort of pick up those kind of conversations and to share good practice. And, you know, we've had quite a few sessions in things that we're really interested in, like inclusive teaching practices and so on, and playing and archaeology, and really interesting stuff. But we're conscious that it would be brilliant to bring that together into a larger conversation that brings people from around the world together, and to think both about sort of developments in teaching and learning in the past, what's going on today and in the future. And so that's where the idea for this conference was born.
So a little bit about how today's going to run. We're delighted that we've got a packed programme for you, and this day is broadly defined into sessions. Our first session is going to be thinking about reflections on teaching and learning in archaeology and heritage. What have been the big achievements? But it's not just looking back, we're also thinking about what needs to change and where the discipline is going. Then we've got our open session, which we had a call for papers for in the summer, which is all about teaching practice today. What's working, what's not working, what would you like to do differently, with a particular focus on inclusion and diversity. Our second plenary is looking forward at the future of teaching and learning, thinking the future of teaching and learning. And finally, we're going to end the day with a roundtable that's dedicated to graduate teaching assistants. So those new to teaching, those that would like to go into teaching but aren't there yet, both Hannah and I benefited from such sessions when we were at that point in our career. Just a really great way of meeting peers, thinking about what the challenges are, sharing good practice, thinking about tips for going forward. So that will be the end session for those of us that are still with us in 8.5 hours time.
And we should say we'll put all the links to all of these kind of things in the chat in a minute. So we want to move on to just quickly talk about our code of conduct. It's really important to us. The round tables that we've been running have been really lovely, informal, sort of safe spaces for people to talk about their teaching and learning practice and everything that's going on. And we want to continue that kind of sense of having this as a pretty informal, safe space for everyone to be able to talk about their practice. And as a result, it's really important for us that everybody adheres to our code of conduct. We have taken our code of conduct largely from well, we've been very influenced by the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology's code of conduct, which Hannah Stein pointed us towards. We're committed to ensuring that our roundtables and conferences provide this safe environment for all participants that's built on mutual respect. We promote a harassment-free environment for everyone, regardless of sex, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, race, ethnicity, career stage, or religion or lack thereof. And so we ask everyone to be respectful of one another, really, and we won't tolerate any harassment in any form. If you feel like there's something going on that's a problem, then please do get in touch with us. And in the chat, you can private message Karina or I if there's an issue that you want to raise. You can read the full code of conduct there. There's a QR code for it. There's our web link to it. And also, as I say, we'll put this in the chat when we've finished waffling on.
So a bit of Zoom etiquette. I'm sure you probably don't need this by now, but just a reminder. Keep your microphones off unless you're speaking. Your cameras are optional. Feel free to turn them on if you'd like to. You might find it better to turn them off if you're struggling for bandwidth. Do type messages and questions in the chat. Because we have got a very busy programme, we've got short papers all grouped together, and then at the end of each session we've got all of the questions at the end. So do type the questions in the chat as we go along, and our chairs will marshal those at the end of the session. And recording, we are recording the session to put on our website afterwards, but if you ever don't want anything recorded, just let us know and we can very easily pause the recording. In terms of as the conference goes on, we'd be really grateful for your feedback. We've got a feedback form and we'll put the link in the chat as well. There's the QR code to it. We'd be really grateful to sort of hear your thoughts, and we'll be running a new series of roundtables in the autumn, starting next month. So we'll be really grateful to hear any sort of subjects that you'd like to see covered. So that brings us to the end of our sort of introduction to the kind of logistics of the day, except that we really want to say thank you to a few people right up at the front of this. We're so grateful to our wonderful co-organiser, Hannah Stein-Chamberlain, who has basically kept on top of everything. She has been the person who's been on our running our Gmail account. So you've probably had an email correspondence with her if you're one of the speakers, and she's been brilliant, and we wouldn't have made it to today without her. So thank you very much, Hannah. Yeah, thank you for our session chairs for stepping in. We're really delighted to have your expertise on board. So we've got Suzanne Lai, Penny Bickle and Matthew Johnson.
And we're really grateful just to everyone who is participating today, whether you come to watch or come to speak. And we're particularly grateful to people who are speaking at unsociable speaking times. We've sort of positioned this conference at this point in the day because we're thinking hopefully this means that people across Europe, the Americas, and colleagues sort of elsewhere in the world, particularly Australia, will be able to participate in some way. So we've got speakers from Australia right at the start and right at the end, so that they're either having a late night or an early morning. So we're really very grateful to them. And I should say thank you very much to the University of Manchester's Teaching Excellence Award, which is covering some of the costs for today.
We've got Aoife Sutton, Sarah Dalton and Mia Coe helping us with Twitter support and on Twitter and on Zoom support throughout the day. And finally, just a note to say thank you to all of those people before us who have inspired this, particularly Don Henson, who died just before Christmas, but also all of our speakers here and key people in our past, such as Thomas Dowson. So yeah, thank you everyone. And without much ado, we're going to pass over to our first chair, Suzanne. So Suzanne has been I had the privilege of meeting Suzanne, who is from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a conference before lockdown over in the States. We hit it off straight away, including talking about teaching and learning. And Suzanne has been a regular contributor to our roundtables. She's been really fundamental in sharing her knowledge, giving tips, and has just been really inspiring to both Hannah and myself. So it just seemed appropriate for Suzanne to kick off our programme by being our first chair. So thanks, Suzanne, and over to you.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much to Hannah and Karina for putting this all together throughout the pandemic and then today as well. And so our first session, we have a bunch of 10-minute talks, as you saw on the schedule. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule because I'm pretty committed to that break at the end and also to our conversation because, you know, as my parents always said, you know, more time here, less time there. And we want to make sure we have a balance. As you see, we privilege the conversation by giving it a huge chunk of time. And so our speakers all know that they'll get 10 minutes and we'll get going with that. I'll keep track of time. All right, so our first speaker is Claire Smith, and she is presenting work that she and Heather Burke have done together. They're both professors at Flinders University in South Australia. And the topic of this talk is teaching archaeology for fun. Over to you, Claire.
Unmute, okay. I just need to share my screen. Can we do that? I think I can. Okay, that will be a miracle. Thank you. It's great to see everyone. It's lovely to see Matthew there and hello Matthew and Suzanne and Meg Conkey, of course, who is like a hero for everybody, and you know, some other people we know. I know there's some few Australians here too. Okay, so in my 10 minutes, I'll try and get rid of that little thing. Okay, so Heather and I wrote this book called Archaeology to Delight and Instruct, but really it was called Teaching Archaeology for Fun. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the things that have informed our teaching over 2 decades now. And I'll try and get rid of that. Yep, okay. So we're really just, this is our philosophy and the things that we're doing. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of us having fun, basically. Okay, we alternate in teaching first year class. This is archaeology, discovering archaeology now. That's my class, so that's the first photo. And a lot of these people are the first people, it's their first lecture at university. So this is for 2021. And so I like to just kind of capture us and get people down, and it kind of gets people talking a little bit, you know, because some people come to uni and they actually don't know anybody when they come. Okay, the idea for all of it is to people to do something. Actually, look, it's really that we don't be bored. That was really what it was. And we thought, I don't want to read the 20th essay on megafauna ever again. And so we let people really, we have a theme and then they do their own projects within it. So one in first year, we have replica artifacts and people choose to do a replica of something. So these are a couple from this year. Lewis Chessman, one guy did a great job of the whole, nearly, well, I don't know, 8 or 9 of the set. So you can get a sense of people having fun producing. You can see the replica down here of the Anubis Shrine and the main proper one up there. People just having fun, but also researching something that they are interested in. So then they write their essay on the Corinthian type helmet or the Neolithic bone wand. So everything's personalized. So we're not, we don't dive boredom. It's all interesting, and people are writing about what they're interested in. I do another topic called the history of archaeology, which I use Matthew's book as the text for, and Georgia Roberts and I are thinking of doing a workbook to kind of match parts of it. And in that we personalise, people write about, as part of it, they write about an archaeologist. So this is some French guy whose name I've forgotten on the left, and a student discovered him this year and he wrote about him, and I didn't know anything about him, but he was interesting. And now he's doing, he has done a biographic article on this guy, Petit, I think his name is, but I would have pronounced it incorrectly. He's done a biographical chapter from my encyclopedia on this guy. Somebody else has written, we do trading cards as part of it, so that might include their star sign, their strengths, their weaknesses. This is Professor Isabel McBride from Australia. This is Robert Braidwood and his wife, who died within, they died within hours of each other, maybe even minutes. And so they both died in January 2003. So you learn kind of interesting things about people. We have a big maritime program, and someone this year did Tom Vosmer. Meg Conkey gets done regularly, Matthew Johnson, Vere Gordon Child. This is my Barunga Field School, which I love, and we have fun when we're there, and people are taught by Aboriginal people, and that's our hut. I live in a tent close by, but that's our little research hut, and our stuff's stored there while we're away. This is the class from a couple of years ago, and the people who are there are teachers, community teachers, but that young girl in the front, Jasmine, is at university. She's finishing a degree on archaeology, the one in the black t-shirt with the kind of skull on it. And she's finishing a Bachelor of Archaeology now. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to use the field school to segue people into university, because we're talking about remote communities, communities of 200 people, 80 people, 90 people, people with an income of 242 Australian dollars a week, which was like about 180 American dollars a week. The community, and that's because people, there's very little jobs, da-da-da. So I have a big research program on using archaeology to close the gap, which is a new program I'm developing at the moment. That's field school. That's Carol Ellett there, and Joe Watkins. I think that might just be his arm and leg you can see there. They came out. Bob Painter came out, and this is something that he sent, comments that he did for an internal report. And of course, being an academic, I said, can I use that for my promotion application, you know, a while ago? And he gave me that, so I shamelessly used that to get promoted. I teach the archaeology of art. Object-based learning, of course, is part of that. But the thing I love about that is, look, there's Vincent McGraw. He's our professor. He's 87. He comes to work 2 days a week, every week. He teaches in my class. He'll teach in a couple of weeks when I teach it again. And he's our Vere Gordon Child. And I just love him. And he comes and talks. He's our professor. And I think, what have I got next? I thought there was one more, but maybe there's not. Maybe that's it. Yeah, that's, yep, that is it. Guys, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Claire. In record time with 3 minutes to spare. So that actually helps us out quite a bit. But yeah, as you all will see, these talks will feel like drinking from a fire hydrant, and you really want to get each drop. And so if you have questions for different people, save them. You can type them in the chat, and we will collect them during the break and then do them during the question session. All right, let's keep moving. So our next speaker is Gavin Lucas, Professor of Archaeology from the University of Iceland, and he is going to talk about teaching theory.
Thank you, Suzanne. I don't have a PowerPoint, so you're just going to have to watch a talking head, I'm afraid. But I'll try and keep to the 10 minutes. I just want to preface this with saying that when Karina and Hannah invited me to speak here at this conference, I was a little reluctant to begin with. Even though, of course, I keep up with what's going on in pedagogy and teaching and learning, and I think a lot about it. I don't think it's one of my strengths. In fact, in some ways, I think of it as one of my weaknesses, but I decided in this talk to basically use that weakness as a position from which to talk about my experiences of teaching archaeological theory at university over the last 20 years. So this is going to be very much a personal sharing of my experiences and some of the problems I encountered. So just to perhaps give you some background, in some ways my teaching experience is fairly narrow. I've been based at the same institution throughout at least my teaching career, which is the University of Iceland. Most of the students I teach are Icelandic students, although we have a smattering of foreign exchange students coming in. And one other thing, the theory teaching that I do is largely directed at second year undergraduates, second year BA students. Okay, so it's quite a basic foundation course in archaeological theory. One other thing I should mention, our class sizes are usually quite small, roughly about between 10 and 15 every year. This year, my theory class is only about 9, I think, so it's a really nice small group. It's almost a luxury to be able to teach in small groups with something like theory, so you can really get to know the students and engage with them and interact with them quite substantially. So it's an ideal scenario. Yet the strange thing is the theory course has been perhaps my biggest problem teaching over my career. I teach, of course, other courses on methods and material culture and post-medieval historical archaeology and so on, but the theory course has always been one that's bothered me the most. It's a little bit of a truism that undergraduates hate theory. There was a great session about this at TAG a few years ago, run by Hannah and Karina, how students hate archaeological theory. Yet the real irony for me is that actually it was me who hated teaching theory, I think, more than they hated taking this course. And I couldn't quite figure out why this was the case. Because theory, of course, is something I love. I really enjoy it tremendously, yet it was the course that I kind of had the most trouble teaching. And over the last 20 years, I've kind of really struggled with why that was and how I can get around that problem. So I'm going to kind of approach this, or the way I've dealt with this, by kind of splitting my reflections a little bit into two aspects of the role of teaching this theory course. And one has been, of course, about the aspect of pedagogy and teaching methods and teaching and learning techniques here, and how I've kind of developed those or haven't. And the other is related to the course content itself. And to some extent, as will become clear later on, I see these two as very closely connected, but initially I kind of tackled them as two very separate problems. So I'm going to begin with the issue of teaching and learning and the pedagogy and teaching kind of methods and techniques. And when I started teaching about 20 years ago, of course, I was this archetypal, very old-fashioned view of teaching, kind of reproducing what I'd learned, which was basically what Karina and Hannah referred to as the banking method. So I'd get up and lecture my poor students for an hour and a half, and field questions now and again. And of course, very quickly, I realized this method wasn't working. I didn't like it when I was a student, so God knows why I would try and reproduce it when I became a teacher, but I did. But quickly realized, of course, it wasn't working for anybody. And so I, of course, tried to find ways in which I could improve and develop this. Talk to other colleagues who were teaching theory courses and get tips from them. Of course, Claire and Heather's paper on becoming Binford was really, really useful for me for rethinking this. But despite my efforts at trying to kind of develop this in the context of my theory course, it proved a little bit obstinate. So the other courses I was teaching were really coming along quite nicely. I felt like I was developing as a teacher. I was introducing lots of new ways to kind of encourage student-centered learning, active learning, participatory learning, and practice-based learning. It was all working very well in my methods courses, in my material culture courses, but theory remained quite obstinate in this. And I guess one of the things I started to reflect on is maybe it's not so much the techniques I was using, maybe there was something problematic with the structure of the course and the course content. So I started to then reflect on whether there was ways in which I could change that. So when it comes to teaching theory, I mean, I guess, again, I fell back on fairly standard approaches, teaching going through the history of theoretical movements, you know, cultural history, new archaeology, processualism, and so on, and going into various schools and isms and theoretical approaches and perspectives. And over the years, of course, I would adjust this, update it, and maybe particularly in the latter years, move away from focusing too much on the kind of paradigmatic approach to theory and focus more on concepts and particular ideas like materiality, agency, and gender, and so on. But still, at the end of the day, nothing was really working very well for me. And I felt more and more kind of unhappy with the way I was teaching theory, while what was happening in my other courses was coming along quite nicely. This was a very different experience. And then I think something hit me a few years ago, about 3 years ago. I started to realize that this issue of pedagogy and teaching and learning was deeply related to the course content in the context of theory. I asked myself, why did I not have the same problem teaching methods as I did teaching theory? And the answer was quite simple, really, when I thought about it, is that when I was doing methods courses or material culture or artifact courses, we were doing stuff. The teaching was doing. We were digging, going on field work, we were handling artifacts, we were actually doing stuff. And when I thought about my theory course, it suddenly occurred to me that we weren't doing theory. I was teaching theory, but we weren't doing theory. But then there's another twist to this. Then I started to reflect on what it is to do theory. And I suddenly realized that actually I don't do theory either. No wonder this wasn't working, because I didn't really understand what doing theory was. And then, of course, I didn't really understand what theory was. After 20 years, you'd think I'd have cottoned on to this. But what really came as a kind of startling revelation was that in a sense, reflecting on the problem of teaching theory ultimately made me reflect on what theory is, and whether this was, of course, what's involved. So over the last few years, I basically flipped my course completely around. And in a sense, what I do in my theory course is archaeology. After all, that's what the students came to learn. They didn't come to learn about object ontology. They came to learn about osteology or artifacts and so on. So what I do in this theory course now is, instead of going through the different theories or the history of theory, I basically take a practice which they are doing in their other courses, like field work, like handling artifacts, recording finds, discussing papers, whatever. We go through the whole kind of archaeological process, and what we do is we kind of dissect it and unpick it and look at the theoretical implications and underpinnings of what it is to do archaeology. So we start from practice and we theorize that practice and work out. And for me, that's kind of really been a revelation. Now, I'm not saying this, of course, is the only way to teach theory, and I'm sure that there's strong arguments to be made for some of the traditional ways of doing it. But for me, and from my experience, this was certainly a really important insight, because what it did is, what it ultimately, I guess the ultimate take-home message here, and I see I'm just about to run out of time, is that it was reflecting on the pedagogy and teaching of theory that made me rethink what I thought theory was. And in that process also then make me change the way I taught theory. It's a kind of cyclical, recursive process. And to me, I suppose the ultimate take-home message is how important it is for understanding this great divide between research and teaching, which is still a very prevalent culture, of course, in institutions of higher education, and how this particular example of teaching theory helps to, at least for me, in some somewhat small way, starts to break down that division. Maybe this isn't the perfect solution, but I feel like I've at least finally cracked something. Anyway, I think I should stop. I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. You're actually right on time. So fantastic. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your journey with us. I think we'll have a lot to talk about in the discussion, since I think many of us have had a similar journey along the way. So our next speaker is Margaret Conkey, Professor Emerita of Anthropology at University of California at Berkeley. And her talk is titled, "What Does It Mean to Advocate a Critical Pedagogy for Archaeology?" Margaret, over to you.
I'm unmuted. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, and I have to get rid of this. How do I get rid of this on the side? Well, let's see. Okay, how's this? Does this work for everybody?
Yep. You can also go into presentation mode, slideshow mode.
Oh, yes. There we go. How's that?
No. Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Great. Good. Well, thanks again. I've followed your emails and many conferences and everything. Pedagogy has long been a great interest of mine. And of course, it comes out of my commitment to feminist principles. And so what I'm going to do today, just briefly, because we've got just a few minutes, is talk a little bit about this idea of critical pedagogy. This is something that probably everybody in this conference knows about. And so in a way, at the beginning, it's just a reminder, if you will, of some of the kinds of issues that can come out of it that can perhaps enhance. I mean, archaeology is the best discipline for critical pedagogy. There is no doubt about it. So let's just take a little look at some of the history of it, which everybody probably knows, and then one sort of idea about how we can advocate it. So I just will go over a few tenets of critical archaeology. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the attributes of archaeology, but I'm sure over the course of the day, you can think of many more reasons why archaeology is so well suited to teaching of critical thinking and critical pedagogy. And I'm sure we'll see lots of examples, you know, even right after me, when my colleague Ruth Tringham, with whom I've done a lot of pedagogy and practice. So, of course, I think everybody realizes that critical pedagogy has a history and that it really is a philosophy of education. And it really actually is applicable to not just education, but to all aspects of life. And the core thing is that it really does insist that issues of social justice and democracy are not distinct from teaching and learning, that we can't just set them aside and go on and do with what we do. And I think Gavin, in a way, demonstrated that by realizing that he really has to do theory as well as talk about it. Of course, everybody should be aware the key person to draw upon, although there are a lot of problems, of course, in retrospect from something that was published many decades ago. But certainly this is a place to start, and it's a really important one for students to read no matter what subject they're doing, which is, of course, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I think is what Claire was working on, and when she works with some of these people from remote communities who are really been drawn into, not by their own wants or doing, into what Freire called the culture of silence, but to allow people and give them the tools with which they can actually become agents in overturning the oppression of the life in which they find themselves. So it's really one in which we can, and archaeology is so perfectly suited to change the structures of society, if only by showing how other societies were and could be. It really opens up alternatives, which is what most people really need. So some of the key characteristics, and many of these are very closely related to aspects of what feminist theory and feminist pedagogy is all about. It's all about empowering our learners. It's community, it's collaboration, it's not a single voice, it's everybody getting together with different voices and applying it outside of the traditional educational institutions, and having to be open and to diverse and international voices. So these are just some of the key issues of critical pedagogy that I think we can put into action through archaeology very easily. This is, you know, one of its inspirational aspects. Besides Paulo Freire, if I had to cite another key resource, of course, it would be Bell Hooks, whose book, and many books, but one of the key ones is Teaching to Transgress. Here, of course, one of the things Bell advocates is an engaged pedagogy, and she herself, it says we have to confront eros and fun, and there you go, Claire, with her saying, you know, let's make this a lively kind of engagement, and that she realizes that theory is a liberatory practice and cannot be divorced from lived realities. And of course, one of the things that we've seen, for example, in the exciting publication of Archaeologies of the Heart a couple of years ago, is that the narratives and the personal experiences of both teachers and learners are central to the pedagogical process, to the teaching and learning process. And that we really need to draw on these things. They're a rich resource. It's like telling a writer to write about what you know. And so in a classroom, it's sort of like, well, tell me what you know about and how can we relate this to the kinds of questions that we're pursuing. So in terms of having a really interesting turn in archaeology and pedagogy, I'd say that looking to archaeologies of the heart is one of them. So what is it about teaching archaeology and heritage that mandates that we can employ a critical pedagogy? There's only 3 out of many that I think we can do, but of course, one of the best ones is that archaeology is full of ambiguity, and that is something that we can really mine for teaching critically. It's also a team and collaborative project doing archaeology, which means you should get your students into teams and doing collaborative learning. And of course, one thing that we feminists in particular have been interested in is the way in which archaeology has the potential to confront and challenge what many people consider to be natural, or it's always been that way, and therefore we can't change it, or therefore it can't be different. But really what I'm going to just mention in the few minutes left today is the aspect of ambiguity. And in this, of course, I not only am going to cite the wonderful paper by Joan Jarrow, Honoring Ambiguity, Problematizing Certitude, but also, of course, I'd like to honor Joan as well. She has this excellent paper, which I think everybody should read, and has a number of even guidelines or key points in it. And she asserts for us that the issues of ambiguity are issues of feminist concern because they are also issues of power. And how power is played out is through the taming and control of the inherent ambiguity in archaeological materials. And so she notices and writes about how ambiguity is dampened and reduced in archaeology through what has been called mechanisms of closure. And what's really interesting is that she talks about specific ways in which ambiguity is dampened, or you never see an article that says, well, possibly it's this way, or maybe it's this way, or maybe it's that way. It's always, and just yesterday there was another article, the oldest archaeological site in the world. What kind of nonsense is that? But that nonetheless, it's that kind of thing that's out there. And these are wonderful things to get your students to look at an archaeological project, preferably one that's in the media, and actually say, well, how did they close down the complexity? How did they push the data around? How did they sort of channel our thoughts? And so these are wonderful suggestions as to how you can actually have fun with a case study and then actually see how things are made to reduce the ambiguity, to promote the certainty, and how that takes away from the process, and how that eliminates certain people, and how it comes out with a story that is problematic, but of great appeal. And she reflects, of course, on what are the ramifications of taking ambiguity seriously and how that might change archaeology. So I think that's it. I just wanted to raise a few issues about ambiguity, about the way in which we can take advantage of it, and why it's an integral part to the critical pedagogy that I would like to think that most archaeologists can deploy in actually teaching critical thinking more widely, which, if you look at the world today, if there's one thing we need more of, it's critical thinking. And it's an understanding of how to evaluate the information that's coming at us from all different directions. And critical pedagogy, its history and its going forward has an awful lot, and you can really improve the lives of your students, whether they become archaeologists or not, by actually getting them engaged with the whole notions behind a critical pedagogy that you yourself can actually bring to the classroom and to the students, whether they're in the communities you work in or whether they're in your classrooms. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. So our final speaker for this session will be Ruth Tringham, a professor of the Graduate School of Anthropology at University of California, Berkeley. And this talk is titled Achieving Media Literacy Through Archaeology and Heritage. Over to you, Ruth.
Hi, good morning. I'm going to share my screen too. So I did change my title slightly, but it still is exactly the same thing. I'm following on from Meg Conkey's presentation. I'm going to talk about some ways in which she and I put critical pedagogy into practice. And I'm going to do this by focusing on the UC Berkeley Multimedia Authoring Center for Teaching in Anthropology, otherwise known as the MACTEA, which we established in January 1998 as a result of Meg Conkey's retention negotiations and her enthusiasm and support of my ambition to share with students the excitement and empowerment of multimedia authoring. At this point, we have to remember that browsing on the World Wide Web was only 5 years old. Most internet access was hardwired with no Wi-Fi. Desktop computers, especially Macs and laptops, were expensive and not accessible for most students. And there were definitely no smartphones. Most importantly, students in the social sciences and humanities had almost no experience of computers beyond quantitative methods, and especially not with the kind of software we intended to teach in the MACTEA. In other words, for most, this would be a very challenging experience. Between 1998 and 2011, when the MACTEA closed and Meg and I retired, these conditions changed rapidly and to an extraordinary degree. For archaeologists in the field, this same period was also transformational from born analog to born digital documentation and recording. The teaching methods and pedagogical philosophy that we, let's see what's happening here. Trying to change the slide. Oh, there we go. The teaching methods and pedagogical philosophy that became the MACTEA's well-known characteristics did not start with its establishment in 1998. They were the culmination of several paths coming together during the late 1980s and early 1990s in the UC Berkeley Department of Anthropology, especially its vibrant group of feminist archaeologists led by Meg Conkey. I suppose I was an early adopter of digital archaeology, starting in 1984 with my Apple Macintosh, loving its visuals and mouse haptics. As the software and hardware developed for documenting and imagining prehistoric houses, my enthusiasm and skills rushed to keep up. With the hypermedia chimera web that I created in 1995, I wanted very much to share the exciting possibilities of linking different stories and data together. And all of this culminated in the production of the MACTEA. And during the period of its existence from 1998 to 2011, the MACTEA program transformed enormously, not only in response to changing hardware and software, but also as our own interests and experience in research, pedagogy, and community building grew, along with our changing and diverse viewpoints of what digital education meant in practice. So in this chart, I've identified 5 major themes in the MACTEA courses. The first one was multimedia authoring, which was the flagship theme of the MACTEA, in which regular curriculum courses such as landscape archaeology, Mesoamerican archaeology, European archaeology were taught through multimedia authoring. Taking multimedia to the community, the next column, we did from 1999 to 2008, when we participated in an after-school program for 6th graders called Expedition in Oakland. Berkeley upper division undergraduates learned critical pedagogy from us and mentored the children in digital storytelling. And it was this point that we really started to educate ourselves in critical pedagogy. Scaling up to incorporate multimedia authoring in large classes, such as Introduction to Archaeology, gave the MACTIA greater visibility in the teaching circles of the university, as well actually as the SAA, when I started to participate in the SAA's undergraduate development program. So the development, the fourth column there, the green one, was the development of the media literacy series from 2005. That was my response to the increasing access to media content on the web through social media and YouTube and so on. In these courses, critical analysis of media was integrated with students constructing creative media works by themselves. In 2020, with the need for such training in view of the glut in fake news and conspiracy theories and the need for critically thinking voters, I came out of hiding from retirement to teach basically use archaeology to teach a media literacy course to UC Berkeley first-year students by Zoom. The final theme of our MACTIA courses is the Cultural Heritage in a Digital World series that Meg Conkey and I co-taught from 2005 to 2011. Together, we came out of retirement also to teach a version of this course in 2015. Many of the principles of our pre-digital, that is pre-MACTIA inquiry-based courses, as well as the critical pedagogical philosophies of Freire and others, were transferred to our MACTIA digital education model that included the list you see here: cumulative skill building, intensive coaching in which instructors are mediators, not transmitters of information, intergenerational and peer-to-peer guiding and coaching, with students experiencing real-world practice, including team production, role responsibilities, and deadlines with a sequence of milestones, as well as contributing to real research. There was a focus on high quality depth of content, that is the archaeology aspects, rather than a finished sellable high-tech product. The reuse and recontextualization of data and media were carried out with a critical and ethical awareness of authorship and intellectual property. And the process, we thought, we stressed, was as important as the finished product. But students also needed to experience the empowerment of a completed project. The MACTIA courses were all project-based, mostly in groups which we called production teams. The path to completing the projects in all courses was laid out as a production steps or sequence of production steps, which we called project milestones, to be completed during the semester, such as storyboarding, media preparation of text, sound, video, and images, and composition with navigational links and juxtaposition leading to create the story. Although the priority of effort was always on the content of their projects, we did coach the students in software and through self-paced tutorials. Depending on the nature of the course and the size of the team, students would take on roles that mirrored a real-life production team. The cultural heritage in a digital age. Yeah, come on. Got too many things going on my screen here. So the Cultural Heritage in a Digital Age series of MACTIA courses developed as a response to our growing interest in cultural heritage ethical issues surrounding its stakeholders and issues of documenting heritage for the long term, not just of their tangible remains, but also the curation of their digital record. So an earlier version you see here of the course, projects comprised of video or a website in this sort of precocious one. But in the more recent versions, we had students actually create site management plans and interpretive plans that were close to realizable projects. And in 2015, the students achieved a degree of presentation sophistication that they never could have achieved in 1998, partially due to the skills of the GSIs and us, but mostly due to the inbuilt skills of this generation of students. I could show you the website of this from this course, but you can go on it yourself, and I'll put it the link into the chat where you can see the actual sort of the plans for some of the sites that the students created for the 2015 and the 2011 version of the course. So finally, through the MACTIA courses, we rose to the challenge of breaking the tyranny of text to transform ourselves into digital publishers of non-linear thought. I say we, since this was a multi-generational effort involving undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty, and a true demonstration of the democratization of technology. Our 2015 course, as well as the 2020 seminar, showed that the physical space, the MACTIA lab, was no longer a requirement for the MACTIA pedagogical model. However, it is good to remember that it's good to remember that the MACTIA was more than just a teaching space. It was a collaboratory where students and faculty would hang out for many hours working on projects together. And that was part of the transformational experience of being at Berkeley and being part of the MACTIA teams. We contributed to in this series of courses in the whole MACTIA effort to the education of a generation of critically thinking, digitally literate authors who could produce high quality content in non-linear formats that took advantage of, but did not the audio-visual and kinetic impact of digital technology. At the same time, we taught them as users and remediators not to fear, but to enjoy exploring the possibilities of the new technologies. And we taught them the social skills of collaborative work that would be needed increasingly in their future lives. The courses that we devised were based in archaeology. Our social anthropology colleagues never did join in, but in fact, any discipline that is rich in media and engages with a multiplicity of interpretations and ambiguity can incorporate the principles of the MACTIA pedagogical model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for ending right when you did, because I was just about to jump in, because as I said, I'm super committed. No, you did great, but I am super committed to our break, because this is the time when we are going to give our participants time to gather their thoughts. And when we come back from the break, we'll ask anybody who wants to ask their question to do so by using the raise hand function. I'll call on people. And those who, everybody, of course, during the break can also just post their questions in the chat during this I think I'll keep it to a 5-minute break maximum, just also to give people time to think and type in their questions. So let's take a 5-minute break, and it is now 9:57. So I guess, sorry, 9:57 where I am. So maybe let's say 2 minutes after the hour, we will come back live, okay? Thank you. All right, so the way we're going to do this, I noticed some people have added to the chat, but if anybody wants to raise their hand, I will look for raised hands, and while we're waiting, and then people can speak, I'll call on them, but while we're waiting, I'll also address some of the questions that came up in the chat, and one was by Lucy. Lucy, would you like to ask your question? I think it's a really important one.
Sorry, which of the questions? Can you hear me?
Well, you asked quite a few good ones, but I think the one that struck me was the one where you were talking about, do we have faith in our general public and our journalists to represent archaeology well? That one.
Okay, no, thank you. Sorry, the question's probably a little bit unclear because I was trying to listen and type out at the same time. I've just spent the break trying to answer both the responses I got to this. Yes, one of the things that I find, and you see this often in other scientific or other disciplines, is the problem of communication with lay people. Was quick to type, but and I'll use it, but it's a problematic phrase for many reasons. Often I find when talking to people, of course not everyone, and this is just anecdotal, that people want a narrative, either kind of fitting to their level, so that could be kind of, you know, what they want out of going to a heritage site. You know, is it entertainment they want? Is it like a very in-depth discussion? Is it just kind of a general overview? You know, for whatever reason, which is perfectly fine. But I think also balancing that with the fact that in many, so I think as archaeologists we've got to, you know, think about that, you know, think about the level that we're talking to. But I think the main problem that we might have to face is that for the most part, archaeologists are not the ones disseminating knowledge outside of the classroom or outside of heritage sites. It's usually journalists, and, you know, and I think some of the simpler narratives come from there. I'm just wondering, you know, do we have any thoughts about, you know, what we could do about that, if there is a thing we could do about that? You know, how do we, you know,
let me see. Thank you. Let me just.
Sorry.
No. You started asking like 5 questions, and I think I want to make sure that we address some of these as the questions come up. I really think that's such an important question. Is like, who is disseminating the information, and do archaeologists actually have access to reaching the general public? And that's basically what you want to know. So I will turn that to the speakers really quickly. Does anybody want to answer? We can just have a couple of the speakers answer this question, and they can circle back because I'm seeing some more questions in the chat. So go ahead, Meg.
Yeah, well, I think Lucy raised this in the chat earlier. One of the biggest issues is, of course, having engaged conversations with the journalists who write these things, who put them on this. Is there a blowback or feedback on the speaker? I'm getting.
It's okay over here. So just probably just for you. So just you can keep answering.
I don't know where it's coming from. But anyway, so I think, and I've had a number of very productive conversations when I've had with various journalists, and you know, although they often say they recognize that yes, archaeology is a little more complicated and it's a little more ambiguous. You know, my supervisor wants me to say this or that. But I do think that, you know, making contact with some of these people who are the regular journalists who then publish things in through the Associated Press worldwide or whatever, is one of the ways to go, is to try to develop some sort of relationships. If you get asked to comment on an article or to review it or whatever, we have to take advantage of that. So I think, but there's no doubt that not only are the journalists themselves interested in presenting, you know, like a major story, that's full of certainty. But also then they have supervisors who do that. So we really have to figure out we have to do our anthropology, our ethnography of how the communication systems actually work, and then in what ways can we participate in them and intervene in them. But that's oftentimes outside of our bandwidth. And so it is a real issue. And if anybody's had any good luck with that kind of thing, it would be great to hear from people about that.
Thanks. Thank you, Meg. Hannah, did you have a question? I noticed you put something in the chat, but then you said you wanted to add on to that question.
I was going to say it out loud and then decided to just put it in the chat.
Okay, we'll leave it in the chat for now then. Claire, did you have a response as well? Just unmute if you had a response. Yeah.
Yeah, unmute. So I'm just wondering, do you guys have the conversation in the US? Because we have that here, and I'll put some articles that we've done, and they're massaged by journalists, but they're written by academics, and they take them out to the general public, and then the Guardian and maybe Sydney Morning Herald, whatever, picks them up. But they've got Conversation Africa, Conversation Japan might be opening now, Conversation Australia. So I'll send you a couple of articles in the chat. Yeah, you've got it there. UK. Does it work in the US as well, or is that not? Has Rupert Murdoch killed?
No, we actually do have something called Public Humanities, which others may have been involved in. So at least, for me personally, I do devote a certain amount of time to public outreach as just part of my program as an academic. And I think that is one way perhaps to address some of these things, is actually creating relationships with certain journalists or certain publications so that they will come to you, or come to people that are good sources. But yeah, this persistent, the idea, wanting a closed narrative is something that's also part of, as some of our speakers said, also part of the reinforcement of power structures, right? So the more we can challenge that, the better. A couple other questions came up in the chat that I want to bring up. One is for Gavin, and somebody wants, I think it was Neil, wants some specific examples of how you do theory. So could you share some of those?
Yeah, that's always the tricky one. I don't think I think of myself as very creative or imaginative when it comes to these things, and I really struggle to come up with some good exercises and issues that we can go through in class. But to give you some examples of the stuff that I'm currently using, well, one of the things I do with my first class with the students is just play a word association game with them, where I get them to write down a couple of phrases or words that come into their mind when I say the word theory. And we jumble all these answers together and put them in a word cloud or something like that, and then we use them as a platform for discussion about what they think theory is. And then, of course, the ideal is at the end of the semester, the end of the term, we review this same question and see if their conception of theory has changed or not. And hopefully it has, otherwise I haven't been very successful. Other things that we do is just like practical things, get them to look at an artifact that they study in another class where they're doing artifact studies, and they're taught how to analyze that artifact in a particular way. And then I told them to kind of just strip what they've learned away and approach it as if it was a modern object, and get them to be more aware of the kind of the different sensory and emotional affective properties of objects instead of purely descriptive things, because often the instinct is to get out the measuring tapes and so on. So just get them to explore other ways of doing that, and of course that links then it leads naturally into discussions of phenomenology and other stuff. One last great example, there was a paper that came out a few years ago, you probably all know, about the 25 grand challenges in archaeology. We go through that, and I tell them to come up with their own grand challenges, things that are relevant to them and in their lives and in their current, in Icelandic society. We talk about what would be the grand challenges for Icelandic archaeology if we broaden it in terms of the current social context and social concerns, and that gets them thinking about the relevance of archaeology to everyday life. So I mean, these are the kind of things we do, and because I've got small classes, I can do this in the context of these groups, and it usually is quite successful. So yeah, those are just some of the ideas I've come up with, but I'm always looking for new ideas, so I can ask that question to everyone as well.
Thanks for that, Gavin. I'll just add on to that, because what you say you do sounds something that I do in my classes that I actually learned from a performance artist and Patty Hernandez, who does Telling My Story, if you look that up online. She calls the exercise bombardment, and it's everybody has to come up with a list of 8 things on a topic, or you split the room. So this actually, I've done this in a class of like 130 or more students, where you split the class and say, in some way, and say, okay, write 8 things related to this one word, and the other side, write 8 things related to this other word. And then you group them, and then everybody in the class, then we start writing them on the board. So that's one way. Another theory application I've done is I've given multiple theories and say, okay, apply these different theories to this one text, usually, or one object, like what would so-and-so say? So it's like having a fake debate between them. And this kind of leads into the next question that came up, which was, I think, from Helen Hope Henderson. And this was about standpoint theory and assuming a standpoint. Do you want to ask that question out loud, or does that kind of cover it?
No, that kind of covers it. I think when I started teaching that article, I thought it was enough to have a PowerPoint and an open discussion, but since it's a philosophical literature, it's philosophy of science, I feel a little insecure really introducing a lot of Wiley into my classes. And I think what I need is some sort of participatory activity where people could generate standpoints either in a group or individually and share them.
Thank you. Meg.
Yeah, well, I have had occasion to teach about a Native American shell mound here on the coast in California, San Francisco Bay, and have the students learn the position of the Native people who ancestors lived there, from the developers who wanted to put a mall there, from the people who owned the stores, and especially when they discovered that under the floor of the stores were Native Americans buried. And so to have a developer standpoint, so in a way it's kind of like different stakeholders, and people had to adopt the standpoint of various issues related to the occupation and then the subsequent destruction of the archaeological site. So that's one way for people to have to really sort of put themselves in others' shoes in a, taking a particular controversy, of which there are many, about archaeological sites. So that's one way to do it without getting into the philosophy of science. Exciting and as articulate about it as Alison Wiley is. So that's just one doing idea.
Great. Ruth, did you have something to add?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, got all my breakfast and everything messed up. Yeah, but I mean, just building on that, in our introduction to archaeology classes, the large ones, we would have each section in the class would divide up into different stakeholders, if you like, or interest groups, just as Meg has described, and actually argue it out to each other in a kind of performance script, so that you'd have a variety of sites discussed by the students. The students would have to come up with the different standpoints of each group of stakeholders. So this is taking it even into a sort of performance context, which actually brought it out, I think, really well.
Thank you for that. Claire.
I sometimes teach, I do a class on the Titanic, and this last year, for the first time, I got people to wear badges and find out at the end whether they died or not, or, but I also, it was a way of people engaging. It was the first time this class worked. Like, I've had trouble with it for a long time, and just suddenly it clicked, and that people were thinking about the architecture, thinking about what it meant to be in third class rather than being in first class, thinking about, and that's an Aboriginal way of personalising it. It's a feminist way of personalising it, an Indigenous feminist standpoint for that. And I find that for me, that class now, I don't have to worry about that.
Great, thank you. As you see in the chat, lots of love, people wanting to be in your class, Claire. So anybody, and there have been a lot of good contributions in the chat as well, if people want to skim through those. In terms of standpoints, I can tell you what I've done a couple of times, and I'm not an archaeologist, just to warn you, but I do sometimes work with objects, is when we've read a piece of literature, read an article, actually having different groups of students take a side of a different person in the argument. So a simple example is in the Iliad, Team Agamemnon and Team Achilles. You know what, and whether or not you like them, you have read the text or read the material, and you debate whether some action should be taken or not. And so people sort of personify just based on what they know. In a magic and religion class I taught, we did this over which path should you choose? Are you team magic or team religion? And you know, what are the options that you have? Like what prayers would you use? What amulets would you use? Things like that, to get people into the mindset of here's what we have to offer, here are the materials we have. So those are just some things related to that question that I wanted to throw in there. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions? Sarah.
Hi, sorry, I just turned my cell phone. I'm not sure whether I can be heard, but hi. It's rather a broad question, but I'll just put it out to you. The speakers all are speaking in different educational contexts. We have people from Australia, people from Iceland, people from the States, people who are retired. And I wanted to ask what the speakers had to say about how these theoretically informed and socially ambitious ways of teaching interact with the neoliberal educational structures that we actually are employed in. One of the things I find very difficult when I'm trying to do teaching which is transformatory or critical is that that's not the structure in which these people are being educated. And that's not just about what's a restriction on me, it's also a restriction on the students and a restriction on what the students expect. So I just wanted to ask the speakers to talk about their experience of that.
Thank you for that. Who wants to go first? Well, I won't force anybody to speak. Who wants to go next? Or has a thought on that?
Okay, I'll go.
Thank you, Ruth.
I got a short comment on that, which is that it depends where you really, as you're saying, Sarah, it depends where you are in the world, because these different, the education is organized in a very different way. Like, as you know, in England, you have this highly structured system where you have courses that already have a structure, and it's very difficult to get beyond that structure. Whereas in the States, or at least in California, and the University of California, which is both a research and a teaching university, it's a much more flexible. We really have free reign to teach a course, a particular course like the Introduction to Archaeology, in any way we wish, and include any content that we wish. They're not structured in the same way. So it just means that's how we can do these more experimental teaching, I think, without the bureaucratic problems of the sort of highly structured other educational systems. I mean, that may be quite not accurate, but I have a feeling that that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, I was just going to come back because Andrew's just put something in the chat that's also there. It isn't even just about the bureaucracy, though the bureaucracy has its challenges, but it's also about what people's expectations are, right? If you have students who come through an education system like that, it's a lot more work to get them to be able to engage in critical reflection and to be a bit more open about the way that they approach things. But I also think that, you know, we're even in circumstances where if we're still thinking of this stuff as experimental, I suppose my question is about how does that actually play out? You know, that there are still systems of power that we're working within, even if we have a lot of freedom within that system of power.
Yeah, great point. Any other speakers want to respond to that aspect?
Well, I'll go again. Just because there is, I know exactly what you mean in terms of the student expectations. We have a great deal of difficulty addressing the whole question of ambiguity to students who want to be told how was it in the past, for example, what happened in the past, and to then say, well, you can never say, there is no one true story, true version, gets a lot of students, you know, you have to be aware that a lot of students are going to have a problem with this because they've been, you know, their expectations is that you, the teacher, are going to tell them what happened rather than they having to come up with the idea of what happened. So a lot of preparatory stuff has to be done, I think. I mean, I don't know, Meg would probably be able to add to this.
Go ahead, Meg.
Yeah, I see in the chat also, we definitely, I think, yeah, thanks, Suzanne. When you turn your microphone off, there's no feedback, so thanks. We have a lot of students that come in, and the reason that they're at a highly selective university is because they've done really well in high school and tests, and in many of them, it is the banking model, you know, that Freire talked about, that others have talked about, that they're used to being, not only being given the information, but being able to spit it back, often uncritically. And so it's really working against a banking model. And actually, the best thing to do, I have found, is to actually have a conversation with the students themselves. What are your expectations from this class? And, you know, how do you feel about, you know, there are students who, when you say, what's your opinion? They go, my opinion? Do I have an opinion? And so I think, you know, trying to get them comfortable in some way about saying, well, actually talking about what it is we're actually involved in, an educational process, and what is pedagogy and what is teaching and why are we all doing this, and trying to get them to engage in it as much as possible, sort of lay it out at the beginning rather than using all of our tricks to try to lure them into it in some ways. And then of course, the other thing is that we have a power structure. The university is a power structure. There's certain people in charge. They're, you know, sort of demanding or mandating certain kind of practices. And the question is for us to use archaeological examples of how that's not the only way in which a human societies can be organized, so that we can actually play against the systems that we're embedded in by exploring them indirectly as systems of power and knowledge. And, you know, using our archaeology, our anthropology, ethnography, and so forth to work against the grain.
Thank you. Claire or Gavin, would you like to add anything to that?
Not much, except my experience is very similar to Ruth and Meg's, and of course, as I said before, I'm quite lucky to have small groups of students, and so we can really explore issues of ambiguity and critical thinking. And in fact, all our first-year students in the humanities, the very first semester, they take a course in critical thinking. And so I guess that it's kind of a little bit, we're trying to kind of build it into our system, at least within our schools at the university.
Can Karina come in with a
Oh,
cheeky
yeah.
point?
Oh yeah, Claire, did you want to? Oh yeah.
Oh,
No, I have help here.
Oh yeah, I was just it occurred to me as well that part of this is about students' autonomy, and they don't realize at first that they can have their own voice. It's like when you start flipping the questions and, you know, trying to get them to think of their own assessment titles at first, that's a real, you know, a real challenge to build in that autonomous thinking. But I think it does come with that kind of democratization of knowledge, really then helps build confidence in our students, but actually they can think for themselves. But with that comes the acceptance of ambiguity. Absolutely. We talk about all the time about our messy archaeology and about how there's not boundaries, and we need to get away from thinking like that.
Thank you, Hannah. I have a couple comments and questions in the chat that I just wanted to highlight. But also I wanted to propose, because it's related, you know, both the question in this recent discussion, it's kind of talking about the either, it's a little bit of an either or. And one of the things that I found useful is to consider it a both and, because people need to operate in the structure. And so teaching them that the current structure is one of the tools that of learning, like banking is a way to learn. It has gotten us so far, but it can't get us, it doesn't get us everything, and it doesn't get everybody everything. And so I've often presented to my students, like, we're co-learners in this. And one of the questions was, how much time do we spend discussing these issues in class? And I spend a lot of time discussing this and giving students the challenge of being knowledge producers as well as knowledge receivers, and present myself as a co-learner with them. And that often like frees them up, but there is a lot of resistance as well if they've been raised and been successful in the model that currently exists. So it's a process. It's never a, you know, we are doing this way or that. So any of those people want to add to the conversation? Or Ruth, go ahead.
I was just looking at one of the people in the chat. I can't remember which one it was, but who talked about the difficulty of having to do a multiple choice test on this kind of thing, and how do you merge the idea of ambiguity with the fact of a multiple choice test. And I think that is a big challenge. I think it can be done, but it is the whole testing and evaluation of students has to be taken into consideration as well.
Absolutely. Assessment, yes, a big area. Claire, go ahead.
I want to pick up on what we've said, but also there's a comment that Penny Bickle put in about she said, my question is to the panel, how much time do you spend discussing your pedagogy with your classes? And I think I do it all the time. I think I say things like, some of us learn through hearing, some of us learn through writing, and so I have some assessments that are physical, some are there, you know, this or that. There's an group alternative, there's an individual alternative, and so on. So I try and just, you know, we're all intelligent people, we're all Homo sapiens sapiens. So, you know, and I have been doing something the last few years, which is no fail challenge. And I put in the topic book, and people were a bit worried, like a couple of colleagues were a bit worried when I first did it. And I said, I don't want anyone to fail this topic. If I can get you through, I will get you. If you can get through, I will get you through. If you need an extension, you got it now. You got it today. University says you have to do, I don't care. I'll give it to you now. I prefer you got your essay in before Christmas, because then you'll have a nice Christmas, but you've got complicated lives, and that's, people have responded to that, so they feel safer, I think. And I used Discord during COVID-19, I know during our worst times, which is a message platform that gamers use, and they can direct message you. And people were direct messaging me all day, but at night, and I'm a night person anyway. And they would tell me about their personal, like, I'm having a problem with whatever. This is why I really can't do it. But my success rate for those classes was as high or even higher than normal. So people didn't drop out. They didn't drop out. But the occasional person fails. I mean, if they hand in nothing and attend nothing, they fail. But it's kind of it was safe, I think. It was safe. And the COVID-19, I've never felt as close to classes as I did to those classes.
Great, thank you so much. So we're actually at the end of our time together in this session, but so I will have to adjourn you in a minute here, but then people can stick around to chat openly if they want. Just some of the themes that I wanted to bring that seem to be across the speakers and even in the questions is this idea of diversity in approaches and assessments, like come and to meet students where they are, wherever they are. And also this idea that learning is fun and can be fun. And we might be, we perhaps as instructors should be the conduits for that, and to remind students that we are here because it's fun and let's make it fun. And so one thing that struck me in particular is when Gavin said, I really didn't like this in this way that I learned. So why am I replicating this? And so, you know, taking that critical approach really fits in well with what Meg and Ruth were saying about really be critical, really look in detail at all the aspects of the instruction and don't take anything for granted. And, you know, and as Claire's talk was telling us, actually go to the people, go to the students and ask them what they're interested in and what questions they have when they approach this material, and have them be the knowledge producers. So thank you everybody for joining us today during this session. And we will continue, you can continue to be in the chat, and also we will continue to chat here if anybody wants to stick around.
Thank you so much for being such an excellent chair, Suzanne. There's been so much discussion and so much sort of time to fit it in. So thank you very much to you, and thank you panel and everyone for sticking around. Like